Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, from cartridges to conservation, Dall sheep of Alaska and the Yukon, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Drew McCarthy. It's a pleasure to have you here today, Drew. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Kendall. It's a pleasure to be here again. And thanks to everyone out there that's joining me today for this presentation. I am coming to you from Teutonia, Idaho, which is my home. And I'm right up on the eastern border with Wyoming. So Teutonia is way in the very farthest east side of Idaho. I can hike out my back door into Wyoming and into Grand Teton National Park. So coming to you from far eastern Idaho. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about an animal that doesn't exist in the Tetons. I'm going to be talking about Dall sheep. Specifically, I'm going to talk about their natural history and their ecology, talk about their evolution, but I also want to dive a little bit into some of the conservation background that surrounds Dall sheep, talk a little bit about gentleman hunters of the early 1900s and how they influenced the conservation movement in this nation, and specifically in Denali National Park and Preserve. So we'll dive into it. Again, my name's Drew McCarthy. I'm coming to you from Idaho. I live here in Idaho, but I'm from Anchorage, Alaska originally. I studied geology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Later on, I got my master's in education from the University of Alaska Anchorage. In between that time, I served in the US Peace Corps in Kenya. And while serving in Kenya, I was an environmental education volunteer, and I worked with the World Wildlife Fund on a basin-wide conservation project around Lake Naivasha in the Rift Valley. Some of you may have been to Kenya, so you might be familiar with some of these places. After serving in the Peace Corps, I came back and actually ended up working for the Park Service for a while. So in this presentation, there's a lot of connections to the Park Service and the early conservation efforts that led to the creation of the Park Service. So the Park Service is still near and dear to my heart. As part of Natural Habitat, I'm leading trips in national parks throughout the nation, but I'm also still connected to friends from my days working for the Park Service. I have been a teacher as well. I got my master's in education. I've taught in middle school classrooms, but never as a paid teacher, just my student teaching. The majority of the teaching I do is working as a guide out in the field. So for Natural Habitat, I lead trips in Yellowstone, both summer and winter. I also lead trips in Greenland, and I do some guiding in Alaska as well. So that's enough about me. This photo of me on the left was taken last fall in Yellowstone. You can see those cliffs up in the background. That's Bighorn sheep habitat. So we're going to be talking a lot about mountain sheep in this presentation. And as a guide, when I'm out in the field, I'm always looking for that high, rocky, cliffy terrain where we might encounter some Dall sheep. Now this picture to me, or Bighorn sheep in the case of Yellowstone, this picture of me up on the right, this was taken in a visitor center in Denali, and I'm posing with one of those visitor photo boards. This is a likeness of Harry Karstens, who's an important person in the history of Denali National Park and Preserve. And so Harry Karstens will come up again as this presentation progresses. So as I've mentioned in some of my webinars before, I spent a lot of years working in Denali National Park. And a big part of that job was hiking out in the field. And then another part of that job was viewing wildlife through the windows of these buses as we traversed the 90-mile road into Denali National Park and Preserve. So there's one gravel road into the park. It's 80 miles long. That road travels through a variety of different habitats, high mountain cliffs where we see a lot of Dall sheep, but also lowlands where we see caribou and grizzly bears, incredible birding. A lot of wildlife action is viewed through the windows of these buses. So as you're driving these buses, of course, your number one priority is always the safety of your passengers and safety on the road. But after that priority, you're constantly looking for wildlife. And so, you know, I mentioned that I studied education, and then I worked as a middle school teacher. Sometimes when driving these buses, I almost feel like I'm teaching a middle school classroom, because on top of providing commentary and teaching, I'm also focusing on the road. I'm looking for wildlife. I'm adjusting the temperature control. I'm juggling about 6 million things at a time while driving these buses. So it's a challenging undertaking. So the road in Denali National Park was actually not around before the park was created. The park was established in 1917 But the road was built between 1923 and 1938 over a series of summer seasons. And for a lot of visitors of Denali National Park, the road really defines a big portion of their experience. And the road is kind of a unique aspect of this wilderness park because it is in the heart of interior Alaska. It is a 6 million acre vast park. It is considered a wilderness park. Much of the land is federally designated wilderness. But there's this road that travels right into the park, and that allows us to really experience wildlife and scenery that's unparalleled anyplace else on Earth. So today's park looks a little different than that historic photo from the 30s. Although the road itself has really maintained the same character and has maintained the same route for all that 100 years plus of park history. Now, when a lot of people think of Denali National Park, they assume that the park was created to protect the scenic values associated with North America's highest mountain, Mount McKinley, now called officially Denali, although for many years it was still Mount McKinley, even though the native name and most locals called the mountain Denali. But the park actually was not created to protect Denali specifically. In fact, the park was created in a lot of respects more surrounding wildlife, and specifically surrounding the wildlife that I would like to talk with you about today, and that is the mountain sheep called the Dall sheep. So as you're winding along that park road as a passenger in a bus or as a driver in a bus, the typical views of Dall sheep are something like what we see here. If you look over down here in the lower half of the photo, you can see there's 5 sheep here. I can't tell you how much time I spend trying to describe to people what they're looking at. So I'll say, look at that highest ridge in the distance. Okay, now look for the cloud. Now draw a line straight down from the cloud to where the green starts. Now draw your eye to the right, and you'll see some little white dots. And then in unison in the bus, you hear people go, oh, and you know you've hit your mark. But this is often the way Dall sheep are viewed from buses along the park road. This is the view of a Dall sheep that we always hope to get, and sometimes you luck out and you get a good view of a Dall sheep. But before I talk specifically about Dall sheep, I want to talk more broadly about North American wild sheep. And I'm going to show you a series of photos of some of the wild sheep that exist in Asia as well as in North America, close relatives of the Dall sheep. Now, all these photos are of rams. When we refer to sheep, the males are called rams. I don't have a bias toward rams, but I am going to show you all pictures of rams for consistency for a relative benchmark for comparative purposes. So to start out, I'll just mention that wild sheep are in the order Artiodactyla. That's a broad mammalian order that includes what are called even-toed ungulates. So they have a cloven hoof. Their hoof is split. They're in the family Bovidae, which is sort of stout-bodied artiodactyls that have a common characteristics of being a ruminant. And so many of you know what a ruminant is, and I'll talk more about that. Dall sheep and mountain sheep are in the subfamily Capernae. And the tribe, the goat antelope tribe, and that further division of goat antelope is just another way that taxonomists and evolutionary biologists organize animals within the system of naming. But that goat antelope tribe is a little misleading, actually, because antelopes are very, very different and not really closely related to goats and sheep. And then I want to talk about the genus Ovis. Within Ovis, we'll refer to a kind of a very relaxed classification of bighorn or thinhorn sheep. So as we're going through these other members of the wild sheep family of the genus Ovis, I will classify them as either bighorn or thinhorn, but this is kind of a loose sort of a non-scientific organization. It's more descriptive. I will mention that the name, the genus Ovis, comes from a Proto-Indo-European word for sheep. No big surprise there. So I want to first point out an animal that actually doesn't live in North America. This is the snow sheep. And this close relative of the Dall sheep and North American mountain sheep actually lives in Siberia, in eastern Siberia. Nivicola, the species name Ovis nivicola, just simply refers to its habitat. It's living in colder, snowy places. Now, if you look up here in the upper left, if you look way up here on the Chukotka Peninsula, on the far upper right-hand corner of this map, you can just see this little red range for snow sheep. They are right across the Bering Strait from Alaska, and that's not a coincidence. And snow sheep represent sort of where the North American mountain sheep likely started from. So the other mountain sheep I want to talk about in North America briefly is the Bighorn sheep. So those of you that have done trips with me in Yellowstone or been in Yellowstone on your own or many of the Rocky Mountain states, you're familiar with Bighorn sheep. Ovis canadensis, the species simply relates to the range of where those animals live. Looking more closely at the range, there's a subspecies of Bighorn sheep that lives south of that red line. But the Bighorn sheep you see in Yellowstone, those are the main species of Bighorn, and they live north of that red line there. So the other Bighorn is called the desert Bighorn, and this is a subspecies of Bighorn sheep, Ovis canadensis nelsoni. So here I'll bring up that map again. And if you look south of that red line, that's essentially the range of 8 different species of Bighorn sheep, subspecies of Bighorn sheep. And there's a lot of them, and I won't go through all of those species, but I do want to mention that 2 of those subspecies of desert bighorn are considered endangered, and one of them is extinct in the fairly recent past. So, you know, within taxonomy, you'll have sort of lumpers and splitters, and of the bighorn, the desert bighorn variety, there's been a lot of splitting that's gone over time, breaking those up into finer groupings. So now I want to jump to thin-horn sheep. So this is that descriptive term, thin-horn. Ovis dalli, or the Dall sheep, is the animal that we're going to talk most about today, but it's one of the thin-horn sheep of the North American mountain sheep. And here is the range of Ovis dalli. So you can see they're throughout South Central Alaska, the Alaska Range, but then also Northern Alaska, the Brooks Range, into the Ogilvy Mountains of Canada, the Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, as well as areas of British Columbia. And then finally, the fourth sort of species of mountain sheep I want to talk about here in North America is the stone sheep. And that is a subspecies similar to the desert bighorn being a subspecies of the bighorn sheep. The stone sheep is called Ovis dalli stonei, and I'll show you its range here. That's the blue blob here. So the pink areas are Ovis dalli stonei are that sort of blue blob that is a little bit lower in that range map. So in terms of size, bighorn sheep would be the biggest of these sheep species that I've talked about, with Dall sheep being the smallest, although they're quite similar in size. I want to jump really quick. I'd like to jump back up to, I'm going to back up a little bit here and just mention a few things about the snow sheep that I neglected to mention. So these animals appeared in the fossil record about 600,000 years ago during what's called the Pleistocene period, or the early Pleistocene period. About 750,000 years ago, the thought is that they began to cross the Bering Land Bridge into North America. So this animal here likely was the progenitor of the mountain sheep, the North American mountain sheep that I've talked about. And over time, those animals, due to geographic isolation, ended up speciating into the different varieties that I just talked about. Okay, so here's just a nice piece of artwork that I found that demonstrates well some of the differences between desert bighorn, bighorn sheep, Dall sheep, and stone sheep. And I want to just point out a few things. So the nice thing about this slide is it really shows the animals in their habitat. So the upper left, we've got the Dall sheep, again, one of the thin horn variety. It's depicted quite well by this artist in its sort of mountainous subarctic environment, and in some cases Arctic. And then just to the right of that, the upper right-hand corner, that is the stone sheep, found in sort of lower latitude mountains, so the Northern Rockies, the Canadian Rockies, and then also some of the mountains in Yukon territory, the Ogilvy Mountains. Notice that when you look at the horns on the bighorn sheep, or the thin horn, excuse me, notice that they splay out a little farther. That's one of the big characteristic differences between thin horn and bighorn sheep. The horns are also slightly thinner, as the name implies. Also, they have a slightly different color, so they're a little bit more yellow. And on the tips, they can even be slightly translucent in a younger animal. Yeah, bighorn sheep, the lower ones, the Rocky Mountain bighorn on the lower left and the desert bighorn on the lower right, you can see that the horns are much narrower, but the horn itself becomes much chunkier. I would describe it basically as a much chunkier horn, more massive. One other big difference not represented in these images because we don't show females, the ewes or the females, among thin horn, their horns rarely, if ever, get beyond 12 inches long. As with bighorn ewes, the horns will actually get longer than 12 inches. So there's an introduction to our four main types of mountain sheep here in North America. Again, likely they came from the snow sheep in northeastern Asia, Siberia, across the Bering Land Bridge to populate North America. That would have been before the last periods of the heart of the Ice Age. And the Ice Age plays a pretty important role as to how these animals were isolated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is an image that shows the modern existing species of mountain sheep in Central Asia and in Siberia. That's the map in the upper left there. And on the upper right, we have an artist's representation of what sort of the progenitor of most modern mountain sheep probably look like. And there weren't traditionally a whole lot of fossils of mountain sheep found throughout Asia. There were a few in Western China. There was a lot of speculation about how these animals related to each other, but you can see their distribution is pretty continuous through the mountainous areas from the Tibetan Plateau, Central Asia, the Tian Shan Mountains, into Siberia and across the Chukotka Peninsula, ultimately into North America. But there wasn't a lot of good fossil evidence of really helping researchers and taxonomists understand what the progenitor animal probably looked like until recently. So there was a recent discovery, fossil discovery, in an area called the Zanda Basin in Tibet, and it's just this area north of the Tibetan Plateau. And the lower left is a picture of that fossil that they found, and this fossil is actually quite similar to modern Ovis species throughout Asia and also in North America. And it really kind of nails down taxonomist understanding that these sheep probably started, and all mountain sheep probably started in the Tibetan Plateau. And it's kind of an interesting story because during the time that these animals were evolving in the Tibetan Plateau, Earth's history was actually quite a bit warmer, or Earth's climate was warmer. But in mountainous areas of Asia, it was still quite rugged and quite cold at higher elevations. Colder on the tops of some of these high Himalayan and Tibetan mountains than it would have been, say, in the subarctic. So these mountain sheep evolved in a very rugged, cold environment, which well prepared them for the coming ice ages and also prepared them to survive in mountainous areas that were more in Eastern Russia and ultimately in North America. So as the ice ages gradually took hold on Earth, and as the Pleistocene period arrived, these animals were well adapted. Sea levels dropped, the snow sheep began to make their way across the Bering Strait, and we have our North American mountain sheep. Incidentally, this new fossil that's found, the name that they've given that new sheep species was Protovis himalaiensis, for what it's worth. Now, if I was giving this presentation to you in the early 1900s, I would have talked about three thin-horned sheep. I would have talked about the stone sheep, I would have talked about the Dall sheep, but there was a third sheep called the Flamin sheep, and for a long time, there was some thought that it was actually its own subspecies. And a lot of the early gentleman hunters that ended up moving into the Yukon, into Alaska, were interested in this relationship between these three charismatic sheep, trying to figure out if a Dall sheep was a unique species or subspecies to a Flamin sheep, which was a unique subspecies to a stone sheep. I wanted to mention Flamin sheep. They're sometimes called a saddleback because you can see their coloring is sort of intermediate between the dark stone sheep, the sort of salt and pepper stone sheep, and the all white Dall sheep. So you often would hear hunters refer to them as saddlebacks. It turns out that these are actually a hybrid. So we don't look at them today as a distinct species or subspecies. As the distinct subspecies of stone sheep and Dall sheep gradually those ranges began to overlap, Flamin sheep, they'd hybridize, and a Flamin sheep is simply a hybrid. So I'd mentioned that gradually the ice ages took hold in North America, and people that look at the relationship between bighorn sheep in the Rocky Mountains and Dall sheep and stone sheep in the Yukon and Alaska, we're curious as to whether there was one refugia from the Ice Age in the north or two. And first, let me back up to explain what a refugia is. And so you can see by this map, the blue area represents areas that were covered by ice. There's actually two main ice sheets in North America that are represented here. The Cordilleran on the left, which sort of ended right about here, and then the Laurentide ice sheet on the right. And those two ice sheets kind of merged together right in this area in what is today British Columbia and southern southern Yukon. So the idea was that there was a common bighorn ancestor to both the thin-horn stone sheep and the bighorn sheep and that we have here in the Rocky Mountains, but that during the Ice Age, those two populations were separated. And when we talk about a refugia, it's essentially an area that was ice-free. And so animals, plants were able to continue to grow and continue to thrive even during the Ice Age. The Ice Ages were long enough that geographic speciation occurred. And so gradual changes to those two populations created two distinct populations. But when talking about the stone sheep of the Yukon and the Dall sheep of Alaska and the Yukon, the question is, did they come from the same refugia or were there two? And so up until very recently, most biologists thought that they basically were in the same refugia. And as the Ice Ages began to end, Dall sheep and stone sheep separated into two distinct species. But recently, they've done some genetic work that has told a different story. So it's very difficult to date the separation because in glacial environments and in the mountains, fossils don't really form. I'm a geologist by training, and I'm not going to go into detail about how fossils form, but fossils, in order to form, they require lots of sedimentation, lots of big rivers with lots of sediment or mud flats or events when animals were caught in mudslides. But in glacial environments and high in the mountains, we have really great fossilization occurring. So essentially what they did is phylogenetic studies. So they looked at the genetic lineages of Dall sheep and stone sheep, and they found that they diverged in the much more distant past than what you would expect if there was just one refugia. So if you look at the green dot that's on this slide, that's actually where they believe now stone sheep speciated as their own distinct group from the Dall sheep in the Beringian area. And because those two ice sheets came together right along that spot, there were likely pockets of land that were not covered by ice where stone sheep gradually speciated. So we have a little bit better understanding. There were actually two separate refugia allowing for the separate evolution of Dall sheep and stone sheep. So this kind of brings us into our discussion of some of the gentleman naturalist hunters of the early 1900s. There was a lot of curiosity about these relationships between these different mountain sheep. And one individual in particular was quite interested. So his name was Charles Sheldon, and he's depicted here in these images. Now, Sheldon, he was from the state of Vermont, and he grew up in the outdoors and developed an appreciation for wild places. He studied at Yale. He became a lawyer. But his family business collapsed, and he kind of had to be a little bit, had to go to plan B, and that plan B ended up working in the railroad industry in Mexico. So from 1898 to 1902, Sheldon was actually in Mexico, working with the Mexican Railway. He also invested heavily in Mexican lead and silver mines, and he made a ton of money. He retired at 35. Not bad. I wish I could have retired at 35. So he became a full-time naturalist hunter. He decided to have his life's vocation be toward protecting and understanding some of the North American animals that he was so involved in. Now, he first got interested in mountain sheep of North America in Mexico, because remember those range maps, the desert bighorns go all the way into New Mexico and into the country of Mexico. He learned Spanish, he hired Mexican guides, and he hunted for desert bighorns. He eventually became involved in the U.S. Biological Survey, which is today's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he received mentorship from a lot of higher ups in the Biological Survey, as well as in a hunting club called the Boone and Crockett Society. So he got interested in mammalogy, and specifically specimen collection and preparation. So in those days, a means of studying animals was to get close to them. One of the ways to do that was to kill them, and it was an accepted form of research. It was a way of collecting specimens and observing the anatomy of the animal, observing its stomach contents. And so Sheldon was a pretty avid hunter. And that's what actually first brought him to Alaska and the Yukon, is he wanted to tease out the difference between stone sheep, Flamin sheep, and Dall sheep. So Sheldon's ultimately devoted 10 years of his life campaigning for the creation of Mount McKinley National Park, what would eventually become Denali. But that's farther on down the story. I want to keep going with this interest he had in his early hunting exploits and in the mountain sheep of the Yukon. Talk a little bit about the Boone and Crockett Club. So Charles Sheldon became involved in the Boone and Crockett Club. And just to give you a little background, if you're not familiar, it's been around for about 130 years. And it's a hunting club, but it's also a conservation club that is really committed to the thoughtful management of wildlands and wildlife conservation. It's committed to sort of a common sense, science-based approach to natural resource management. And its efforts since its inception have saved multiple species of North American wildlife from extinction. What was happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s was market hunting. And so this was essentially people hunting wild animals to sell the meat and to make a living. And market hunting was booming here in this part of the world where I am right now, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In fact, bighorn sheep probably were numbered between 1.5 and 2 million in population in this area before market hunting started decimating those populations. So the Boone and Crockett Club was concerned about this market hunting. It recognized that it was threatening America's big game populations. So Theodore Roosevelt started the Boone and Crockett Club, and he did it after traveling to the Montana Territory, to the Yellowstone area. He did some extensive travels between 1883 and 1886. In 1887, he started the Boone and Crockett Club. So it's important to know that the Boone and Crockett Club was pretty heavily involved in the establishment of our major federal land management agencies today. So the Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service were all heavily lobbied in our government. Their creation was heavily impacted by Roosevelt and others within the Boone and Crockett Club. Today, they're still involved in a lot of research, and most notably the research of wolf and moose relationships in Michigan's Isle Royale is funded by the Boone and Crockett Club. So Sheldon's involvement in the Boone and Crockett Club evolved over time, but initially he helped to kind of steer the club from this original idea of sort of riflemen and camaraderie of hunting toward more sort of far-reaching ethical conservation goals. So he really steered that organization as it evolved. So Sheldon made a lot of contacts through the Boone and Crockett Club, and one contact I really want to talk about was kind of key to an expedition that was made into the Yukon to study these rock sheep and Dall sheep, stone sheep and Dall sheep. So this is Carl Arungus, and so Arungus, he was an artist, and one of the tools that early naturalists used as well as hunting, was illustrations. And so it was important in studying these mountain sheep of the Yukon to get somebody on his team that was a skilled artist and was a skilled observer of animal form. And so if for those of you that have done Yellowstone trips, Carl Arungus is well represented in the National Museum of Wildlife Art over in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They have one of the largest collection, or the largest collection of Arungus's work anywhere. So over time, I've kind of developed an appreciation for Carl Arungus, and you'll see his work if you join one of our Yellowstone trips, some of our Yellowstone trips. So Arungus was born in Germany. He ultimately immigrated to the United States. He became the most important big game painter in early sort of the field in early North America. He studied at the Berlin Art Academy. His original focus was ornamental design, but he was not interested in that. And he ended up spending a lot of time at the zoo and actually sketching animals from a distance at the zoo. The thing that was key about Arungus's times painting at the zoo was that you can't contact the animals. So you have to, from a distance, become a keen observer of their form. But he needed to really see more. So he actually ended up joining spending a lot of time in glue factories in Germany, because they would slaughter animals for a number of reasons, but also for the production of glue. And he would sketch the anatomy, and he'd dissect the anatomy and learn more about the basic form. In 1894, Arungus's uncle invited him to the US, or to North America, to hunt in Maine. And shortly after, he traveled to Wyoming, and he did more hunting in Wyoming. And he painted and did extensive studies of his trophies, which again allowed him to better understand the anatomy of the animals that he painted. Arungus also had a real appreciation for the landscapes, as these images show. Arungus's artwork is quite spectacular, and these examples show. So in the summer of 1904, Arungus and Sheldon explored the Yukon Ogilvie Mountains with another naturalist named Wilfred Osgood. And again, their purpose of this research was to try to tease out the difference between the fanons and the stone sheep and the Dall sheep. Now, ultimately, Sheldon came to the same conclusion that fanon sheep were some sort of a hybrid, but he was kind of the one refugia field of thought, so he didn't recognize. He thought that Dall sheep and stone sheep were part of that same Beringian refugia during the Ice Age. This was prior to our ability to do genetic lineage relationships, and understood that there, in fact, were a different population. This is some of the artwork that Arungus produced during that trip to the Yukon. And this kind of started Sheldon's involvement in Alaska and the Yukon. And there was about 5 straight years where he was in this part of the world studying mountain sheep. So after the Yukon expedition, Sheldon really wanted to go to Alaska. And so what was happening in that time is there were early expeditions heading into its interior of Alaska and beginning to understand some of the country just north of the Alaska Range in today's Denali National Park. There were 2 expeditions. In 1902, there was Alfred Hughes Brooks, did a survey of the mountains. And also in 1903, Dr. Frederick Cook. It's a whole other story, kind of a funny mountaineering story, but they also produced maps and journals describing what they saw, and they described huge amounts of game. And so Charles Sheldon decided, I need to go there. I need to explore these regions and understand better the Dall sheep in the area. So upon his, so this was a pretty complicated journey for Sheldon to get into interior Alaska. It started by steam shipping to the Alaska coast, then traveling overland to the Yukon gold fields, then traveling along the Yukon into the interior of Alaska, finally heading south into today's what we call Denali National Park. But upon his arrival, Sheldon met Harry Karstens. So Harry Karstens would ultimately become the first superintendent of Denali National Park. And they were kind of a wilderness version of an odd couple. So Karstens was born in Chicago. He received a limited education, but he considered himself a PhD of the backcountry. So he had a lot of backcountry skills. They met because Sheldon needed a guide and Harry needed a job. So the two of them teamed up and they used Carson's skills together with Sheldon's skills to explore this area that ultimately would become Mount McKinley National Park. So there were actually two different trips. So in 1906, they did a summer-long trip together with some others, and didn't actually find that many sheep. It wasn't until the end of that summer 1906 expedition that they actually found sheep that they were able to shoot, able to dissect and study. So so Sheldon actually came back the following year in 1907, and Carson's and Sheldon actually built a cabin, spent a winter in what would become Denali National Park, and that was where they first came up with this idea of this area needing to be protected. It was an area that was worthy for conservation. Not only did they know thousands and thousands of Dall sheep, but there were abundant caribou, moose, bear, wolves. It was an area that they saw as really needing to be protected. I want to read something that Sheldon wrote about Carson, his companion in the wilderness of interior Alaska. I can recall no better fortune than which befell me when Harry Carsons was engaged as assistant packer. He was a tall, stalwart man, well poised, frank, strict, and honorable, one of the best dog drivers in the North, and particularly fitted by youth and experience for explorations in little-known regions. He's provided himself a splendid fellow, thoroughly efficient in all that pertains to practical life in the northern wilderness, inventive and resourceful. So these two became good friends, and though they didn't overlap later in life, the ideas that they discussed in that cabin between the winters of 1907 and 1908 had a profound impact on our conservation system in Alaska and throughout our country. So these are some of the original maps that were drawn of the proposed park that would be created as a result of Sheldon's research in the area. The upper left shows just sort of the original park boundaries that were sketched. The lower left shows the original Mount McKinley National Park that was eventually established in 1917. Now, what's important to know is this map to the right shows, you can see the original park, but you can also see the Alaska Railroad. As the Alaska Railroad was being constructed and completed, there was more pressure. Towns were building, there was more pressure on wildlife, more market hunters were coming in, killing more sheep, which made the creation of that park even more critically important. And it should be noted that the Boone and Crockett Club, and Sheldon actually expressed this, they had a real purpose and drive to create game preserves within Alaska in particular, as well as in the lower 48. And a lot of it was for conservation of game, for enjoyment and for science, but then also for hunting. So here we have today's Denali National Park and Preserve as it exists. You can just still make out this gray box in the center. This is the original boundary that was, or close to the original boundary that was proposed by Sheldon and Carson. In 1980, the park was expanded. It went from 2 million acres to 6 million acres. What was originally established as Mount McKinley National Park eventually was renamed Denali National Park and Preserve. And I should note that the studies that Sheldon and Carson did of wildlife movements beyond Dall sheep actually still helps to inform park boundaries in 1980 when the park was expanded, and to some extent still it impacts the park management today. One example is, in the summers, the caribou are mostly up against the mountains here, and that's what Sheldon and Carson's initially observed. But it wasn't until their winter that they noticed that the caribou actually would winter in these lands to the north. And so that's just an example of one of their observations that kind of informed decisions in 1980 to help expand the park further to the north in order to more fully protect the caribou in that part of the Alaska Range. So that's a little bit of the history, a little bit of the connection of some of the early gentleman hunters that created McKinley National Park or worked to help the government create that park. I want to return to Dall sheep in specific and finish up here with the last little bit of time just talking about some natural history of Dall sheep. So first of all, Dall sheep are one of the reasons that they're so prized by hunters and as wildlife viewers and photographers alike, is these spectacular horns. And it should be noted these are true horns, unlike antlers. They keep those horns for the length of the life. A set of horns like this on a ram Dall sheep could be up to 30 pounds. I want to point out that this particular horn, you notice that it's damaged, it's broken. They call that brooming. And that actually can be done, sheep will do that sometimes if their horns get too big, it actually obscures their vision, and so they'll purposely kind of wear down the horns to help improve their vision. The horns primarily are used for display and dominance. In desert bighorn sheep, they'll actually use them as tools. They'll use their horns to scrape the thorns off cacti. In Dall sheep, they haven't really noticed them used for tools in that way. Another interesting thing about horns is they're used for thermal regulation, and this comes into play more in animals like desert bighorn, but because the core of the horn is vascularized, a lot of heat is actually lost through the horn, the bone that is within the horn, and it's used to help regulate the temperature of these animals. So you can age a bighorn, which is this photo, or a Dall sheep, based on these sort of annular segments on the horn, much like you can age a tree by counting the tree rings. One thing I want to point out, there's a specific point right around the 4th year of a bighorn, a little bit later in life for a Dall sheep, that represents when the animal started breeding. And because breeding takes a certain amount of energy, that actually shows up as a very specific divot in the horn. It marks a very specific period in the life of the bighorn in this case, or in the case of a Dall sheep. In terms of the general description, or sort of a rough estimate of age based on the curl, a 3/4 curl is about a 2 to 3 year old animal. 4/5 curl is about, or a half curl is a 2 to 3 year old animal. A quarter curl is about a 4 to 5 year old animal, and a full curl is about a 7 to 8 year old animal. But this can vary widely depending on location. So that might be different between a Dall sheep in the Brooks Range, which is Arctic, or Denali, which is subarctic. They would grow a little faster in subarctic conditions. It's not quite as harsh. Females have smaller horns. It's not as practical or reasonable to age them based on the segments on their horn, because females are genetically programmed to not put as much keratin into the horn growing as a male does. But also they have other demands on them during their life. They're nursing, they're raising lambs. And so the stress that those animals are going through, the females throughout their life, actually causes those the much less growth in the horn. So it's not as obvious the age by simply viewing the horn. A couple other interesting behaviors relating to horns. So rams do these head-to-head head banging, and there's some adaptations to help that not injure the animal. So if you look over here on this sketch to the right, you can see there's what are essentially called, there's an open pocket in the skull with these bony struts. And this type of bone is called a pneumatic bone, but essentially it acts as a shock absorber, and it helps absorb that massive amount of force that head banging causes. The other thing that's interesting are these sutures in the skull. If you look at these very complex sutures that join the different panels of the skull, in a bighorn they're extremely, and in a Dall sheep they're extremely complicated, and they also flex and allow the skull to flex to absorb that shock. A Dall sheep a ram can withstand 60 times more force than a human skull would of impact, which is pretty impressive. So thin-horn sheep also use their horns in other ways. So they'll do these sort of lateral displays. So it's not always headbutting. Headbutting only comes when you have two animals that are really well matched. But if two rams are kind of sizing each other up, they'll do these lateral displays where they can look at the size of each other's body, they can look at the size of their horns and decide whether they want to escalate into one of those head-to-head matches. Again, only evenly matched rams will engage in those head-to-head matches. So other types of direct contact in these sort of dominance relationships include jumps and kicks. They'll push each other from the side. These types of contests are almost always won by the older, larger, more experienced ram. And the purpose for this is access to females. So, when females come into estrus, a more dominant ram will be able to have access to mating with those females, and that's the whole purpose of these dominance displays. this is a really great example of how horns can disrupt eyesight. You can see it's just the angle of photo, but you can see how the way that curl is right near its eye and why occasionally they do that brooming. But I do want to mention mostly with this image, they're thick pelage. So they have a very fine under fur, but then their outer fur is this sort of more wiry, stiff, hollow guard hairs. And their winter coat can be 5 centimeters thicker than their summer coat. So you see them in the spring, and they definitely look pretty puffy. But as the summer progresses, they're molting huge amounts of fur, and that molt usually occurs between March and July. The males molt before the females generally. So in winter, these animals, they don't migrate like a caribou, for instance, or a reindeer, but they have a huge variation in landscapes that they'll exploit depending on food availability. So they're what we call an altitudinal migrant. So they'll go to, in some cases in the winter, they'll actually go higher on mountains because the wind has blown the snow away, making their food available to them. Very occasionally, a thaw that will create a crust on the ice can be incredibly damaging to Dall sheep because they then can't dig through the snow to get down to the vegetation that they're looking for, and that can cause huge population crashes after a snowy period with a warm up and a crust. This is a common behavior that you observe among rams. This is called the Flamin Response, and essentially they're exposing an organ. It's called the veronasal organ, and it can gather chemical information in the air. So they lift that lip up, and they breathe in through this organ, and it gives them information about each other and about females. So after weather, predation is the highest cause of mortality in sheep, in Dall sheep. So in this picture, it really well describes, you can see this group of lambs and ewes are right close to these cliffs. So sheep will always hang out right next to cliffs. They call that escape terrain. Predators of Dall sheep in Alaska, wolves, bears, coyote. Coyote will typically only kill the lambs. And then often golden eagles will swoop down and knock the lambs off the cliff, and then they'll go and they'll eat the remains from that lamb. It turns out that Dall sheep actually have incredible eyesight. They can see threats from up to a mile away. And they have a very horizontal slit pupil, which kind of gives them panoramic vision. It's like the pano on your iPhone, but they've got that on both sides. And so they're constantly scanning for predators 360 degrees. So they're incredibly agile. They can get way up into steep cliffs. Often they're going after mineral licks. Certain times of the year, they need essential minerals. You can see I mentioned they're artiodactyls, so they're those even-toed ungulates, but they have a very interesting hoof that allows them a lot of traction. It's very hard on this outer edge. It's like your fingernail or harder, but then the inside is very soft, more like the heel of your foot. And so that helps these animals. A 2-inch foothold they can stand on and hoist themselves upward. On the descent, they have these dew claws, which you can just see off to the edge of this image. They actually will sink down into the gravel and will act as brakes, helping to slow their descent. So Dall sheep, they eat sedges and grasses. They eat broadleaf plants like willows, depicted in this picture during the summer months. In the winter, as I mentioned, they dig through the snow. They're eating the remains of plants, but they're also eating a lot of lichens in the winter, and that's very different than other thinhorn and bighorn sheep throughout North America. Dall sheep have that ability to eat lichens. So Dall sheep will have long periods where they have to rest. They are ruminants, so they have a multi-chambered stomach full of bacteria. It helps them break down their woody food source, plants, grasses, lots of cellulose. I shouldn't say woody, but cellulose. It's very difficult for them to digest that. So they'll spend times ruminating. They'll be stationary. They'll regurgitate what they've been eating. They'll chew it again. They'll swallow it again. Then we'll enter this 9-stage digestive system that helps those animals get every single bit of nutrients out of what they're eating. At the end of the cycle, when they defecate, as a means to minimize moisture loss, they have incredibly dry and dense droppings. So all that moisture gets taken out of their waste before they defecate. You can see how that'd be an obvious advantage for, say, a desert bighorn, but for a Dall sheep in Alaska, it's actually quite dry, the areas of their ranges. There's very little snowfall, and moisture retention can be a really big challenge for an animal during the winter months. So this is a female. I wanted to talk a little bit about reproduction. So first of all, I'll mention that females, they'll have 4 distinct ranges throughout the year. They'll have their winter range, their spring range, their lambing range, and then their summer range. The lambs, after they've been dropped, they'll kind of adopt the same seasonal rotation as the ewes. Typically, they'll have 1, sometimes 2 lambs, but the average number of offspring is 1. The gestation period is about 5.5 months, and they wean from their mother from nursing after about 4 to 5 months. The lambs are born in late May and early June. The ewes will seek solitude in the cliffs in order to drop their lambs. They lick them immediately after they're born, and within hours they're up and they're standing. They weigh between about 2 pounds at birth. They're not very big, and they can stand after 15 minutes after they're born. So they're moving pretty quickly, and they'll grow to about 60 pounds in about 9 months. So they grow fairly quickly. So I want to finish up here because I want to leave some time for questions, but I just want to mention, Denali National Park was established in 1917. That means that they had their 100th anniversary in 2017. And this was Winterfest, which is a park entrance activity they have in the spring, kind of a celebration of the winter months. But this was a special one because it was the 100th anniversary of the park. And kind of these 4 men here in this picture, the one on the far left is the superintendent of Denali National Park today. His name's Don Stryker. But the gentleman second from the left is Charlie Sheldon. So that's the grandson of Charles Sheldon. And then the 2 other gentlemen in the photo are representatives from the Alaska Boone and Crockett Club. And Charlie Sheldon decided to donate his grandfather's firearm, the firearm he used in the Yukon and in Denali during his explorations to the park. And so today, in display at the park, you can see that rifle together with the pen that was used by Woodrow Wilson to establish Mount McKinley Park in 1917. And it's a good reminder, it's a good kind of synopsis of the relationship between these gentleman hunters of the early 1900s and the park that we have to visit today. So with that, I will hand it back to Kendall, and I can take some of your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Drew. We do have some really good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, there are quite a few questions about the horns, so people want to know all kinds of things, so I'll kind of combine these questions for you into one. What are they made of? Do they ever shed their horns? Are they hollow or solid?
Okay. Well, the horns are made out of a compound called keratin, which is the same as your fingernails. And in a mammal like a bovid, like a Dall sheep, that same keratin that makes up their hooves makes up their horns. It's not a terribly hard material, which is why over time they can wear down at the tips. They do retain those horns for their entire life. So a horn, unlike an antler, stays with the animal for its whole life. That's why those sort of segments begin to form as the horn grows, and that's why you can age an animal based on those segments. Those segments represent essentially how healthy the animal was during a year. So in the winter, it grows a little more slowly than in the summer, and that creates the segments there. There is a bony core, what's called the horn sheath, that sticks up off the skull of the sheep, and the horn grows off that, the keratin horn grows off that horn sheath. That's the area that's highly vascularized. That's what sort of loses heat for a desert bighorn. It's one of the ways they help regulate their body temperature by all those veins in between the bone and the horn. There was something else I wanted to say about those horns, but I think I answered that question.
Great. Someone was wondering, you mentioned the Flamin Response, if other animals have the same response.
Absolutely, very common in mammals. Yep, that pharonasal organ is present. You see horses do it. If you think about Mr. Ed and the old Mr. Ed episodes, they were actually triggering that horse to do that by releasing scents. So absolutely, other animals do that Flamin response.
A few people were wondering if the fur that is shed, if people collect that and can spin it into yarn or make anything out of it.
I've never heard of people doing that. It is actually common to find that shed fur when hiking in the subarctic. What I'll often do is especially if I'm with guests, is I'll pick that up and pass it around and let everybody smell it, because it smells like you would expect a sheep to smell. That lanolin odor is very much in the fur. I've never heard of people collecting it for reasons except naturalists sharing the fur with guests. I will say that in the spring, as they're molting, you'll see them, rams in particular, will take their horns and kind of scratch their back, and you'll see tufts of fur take loft in the wind. You'll also see them back up against rocks and sort of scratch themselves on the rock. And again, if it's windy, you'll see that thick winter's coat just blowing off in the wind.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the original boundary of the park was determined?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So, these Carsons and Sheldon and the others in their party were traveling by horseback, so their range of movement was somewhat limited. But particularly during their second longer trip in the Alaska Range region, the one that was from 1907 to 1908, they were able to focus a little more on the specifics of the terrain. They weren't in as much of a rush as they were in that 1906 trip. So essentially, they were looking at what were the areas where animal concentrations were the highest, but then also habitat constraints, like where the rivers were flowing north. Through some of the mountain ranges, the rivers would sort of narrow and then open up again. And those were natural boundary spots for the northern part of the park. Also, they were taking into consideration the human habitation. So as well, Denali in the early 1900s, there weren't many native Alaskans that were, say, living in that area permanently. There were certainly native Alaskans that were involved in some of these expeditions and still living in the Koyukon and Tanana Flats. But the miners, non-native miners, had started to establish themselves in areas north of the park. And so it was a tricky balance. They wanted to create this park, which was kind of a new concept, to protect the animals, but they couldn't drive out the miners. They couldn't alienate the miners that were making a living off the land. So the boundaries in a lot of cases accommodated and allowed for the mining that was already established.
So final question I'll take today is someone just wondering about the relationship between domestic sheep and these wild sheep that you were talking about. Did the domestics evolve from them?
Well, they're all part of that subfamily Caprinae. So I mentioned the goat antelope tribe. Modern domestic sheep are in that same tribe, but they were not domesticated from wild mountain sheep that we've discussed, any of the species that we've discussed in this presentation. They were domesticated from other sheep in Western Europe and in Central Asia. So distant relatives, but they weren't domesticated Dall sheep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Drew. This was really fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time to present today. I'm going to hand it back over to you for any closing comments you want to make.
Sure. Well, I did find a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which I think is kind of appropriate when we talk about this balance between the role that hunting played in conservation and the role that hunting and wildlife, understanding of wildlife movements played in the development of parks. And I'll just finish by reading this Roosevelt quote. "Defenders of the short-sighted men who in their greed and selfishness will, if permitted, rob our country of half of its charm by their reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things, sometimes seek to champion them by saying that the game belongs to the people. So it does, and not merely to the people now, but to the unborn people. The greatest food for the greatest number applies to the number within the womb of time, compared to which those now alive form an insignificant fraction. Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us restraint, an unprincipled present-day minority, from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations. The movement for the conservation of wildlife and the larger movement for the conservation of all our natural resources are essentially democratic in spirit, purpose, and method. Thanks everybody for joining me today.
Thanks again, Drew. That was lovely. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.